On Christmas night, my dad tossed a crumpled 10 and 2 ones onto my plate and said loud enough for everyone, "You are a $12 mistake." The room went stiff. Forks stopped midway. Carols from the living room turned into a faint buzz, and every pair of eyes either locked on me or snapped away too fast. My little sister Maddie lifted her phone just high enough that I could see the camera app open her thumb, hovering hungry for drama. The table was a holiday picture: polished silver, perfect roast wine in tall glasses, the tall tree glowing in the window. All I could really see was 12 wrinkled dollars sitting in a splash of gravy, like a tip someone left for a bad meal. Dad leaned back in his chair and repeated himself slower this time, like he was savoring each insult. $12, Avery. That is about what you turned out to be worth. Nobody told him to cut it out. Mom stared hard at the cranberry sauce, her fingers trembling just enough to make the spoon rattle. An aunt reached for more bread with studied focus. Maddie tilted her phone to catch his face and mine in the same frame. "The Army did not fix you," Dad added, his voice climbing over the music. 10 years in uniform and you still do not listen. Even your pay grade screams average. We poured more than $12 into raising you. Worst investment I ever made." The words hit with the clean force of something he had been rehearsing for years. Heat climbed up my neck. The people who had watched me grow up suddenly found their plates, their napkins, their glasses very interesting. Inside my head, another voice began speaking, flat and steady the way it did on long nights in the operations center. 28. Captain Avery Lockwood, United States Army, cyber warfare officer. The one they woke at 2 in the morning when an alert could mean either a glitch or the start of something that would knock out half a state. The officer who led a classified response last summer that kept the East Coast grid from blinking off like a row of dead candles. The youngest company grade officer in years, invited to brief the Joint Chiefs in person because my report caught what entire teams had missed. In secure rooms with no windows, people with stars on their shoulders listened when I talked. In this dining room under this chandelier, I was just the difficult daughter who did not smile enough in photos and did not make as much money as Maddie with her bright marketing job. Dad pointed his fork at my dress uniform like it offended him. "And this costume," he said, waving at my name tape and my ribbons, "you hide behind that because you have got nothing else. Take it off, and you are the same sulky kid you always were." Something in my chest stopped reaching for him. 10 years of bending to fit his idea of a daughter, and this was the number he chose. $12. I picked up the greasy bills between my fingers, folded them once, and set them back on the edge of his plate. When I spoke, my voice stayed low and calm. "You really should not put a price on something you do not understand." For a heartbeat, he looked surprised. Then he laughed sharp and showy and turned to the rest of the table like a man on stage. "There she goes," he announced. "Any minute now she will storm out and run back to her little base. Walk out like you always do. That is what $12 mistakes do." Mom reached out her fingertips, brushing my sleeve, her eyes begging me to swallow this one, like all the others. Maddie's phone crept closer, framing my face, waiting for me to crack. I pushed my chair back, careful not to scrape the floor, and stood. I slid my dress coat on, feeling the weight of the fabric settle over my shoulders. I did not give them a speech. I walked through the foyer, past the wreath, past the framed family photos, where I always seemed slightly out of place, and opened the front door. Cold air rushed in, clean and sharp after the heat and noise. Outside, our little cul-de-sac glittered with frost under strings of cheerful lights. My breath turned white in front of me as I stepped onto the walk. Behind me, the door clicked shut, muffling the voices inside. For the first time, I let myself think the thought I had pushed down for years: the people who share your last name can still have no idea what you are worth. I was turning toward my car when a harsh white glare poured over the lawn. Headlights high and bright, not from a neighbor's sedan. One black SUV rolled into the cul-de-sac, then a second, then a third engines, idling in a straight line in front of our house. No logos, tinted windows, government plates, the kind of vehicles that did not show up by accident. Behind me, the front door opened again, and voices spilled out sharp with curiosity. Curtains moved up and down the street as neighbors leaned closer to their windows. The rear door of the middle SUV opened, and General Helena Stratford stepped down, 4 silver stars bright on her shoulders in the porch light. She wore her service uniform like it was made for her rows of ribbons and badges, telling a story my family had never once asked me about. 2 military police in dress uniforms flanked her hands in black gloves, resting easy at their sides. She looked at me first, and some tight knot in my chest loosened at the quiet recognition in her eyes. Then she looked past me up toward the doorway, where my father, my mother Maddie, and half the family now crowded the threshold like people who had paid for front-row seats. My dad cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders, as if that might make him look like the man of the house he always claimed to be. "Is there a problem in the neighborhood, Mom?" he called. General Stratford did not look away when she answered. "There is now." Her voice carried across the frozen yard, calm and sharp as a clean cut. She let the silence hang for a long second, long enough for everyone on the street to feel it. Then she spoke again. "Christmas or not, you just publicly humiliated my best cyber officer." The sentence landed heavier than anything he had thrown at me all evening. I watched his mouth open and close. For once, there was no fast joke, no easy insult. General Stratford took one slow step forward, authority rolling off her in a way no one at that doorway could pretend not to feel. "Everyone," she said, eyes fixed on the people who had spent an entire dinner, shaving my value down to 12 wrinkled dollars. "Kneel now." If you are wondering how a girl her own father priced at $12 ended up with a 4-star general standing on his lawn ordering people to kneel for her, we have to go back 10 years. I was 18 in the spring of 2014, still living in the 2-story house on Maple Ridge Lane in Charlotte, the place with the blue shutters and the cracked driveway where the camellias always bloomed too early. The place that looked peaceful enough from the sidewalk, but held a quiet tension inside its walls, the kind that made you breathe shallow without knowing why. Dad Thomas Lockwood sold insurance out of a small office on Albemarle Road, a man whose temper rose faster than the temperature in July, and whose pride was built on how loudly he could speak in a room, while Mom Elaine stayed soft and cautious, gliding between moods like someone walking on a frozen lake that might crack if she stepped wrong, and Maddie, 16 and bright and golden, curled around her phone on the living room couch, the daughter Dad always introduced first at barbecues. After school, I would sit cross-legged on my bedroom floor with my battered laptop, balancing on a stack of textbooks, practicing code challenges, trying to break into mock systems on CTF platforms, teaching myself the language of the digital world because it felt like the only place where rules did not shift with someone's anger. Downstairs, the TV blared evening news, and Dad cursed at politicians and the military alike, muttering that troops were nothing but a tax drain, that people like me should not get ideas about serving a country that did not care about us. And every time he said it, I felt something in me push back, quiet but stubborn. At dinner, he would clap Maddie on the shoulder and tell her she was a winner, a natural, a star waiting to be discovered. Then he would turn to me and say I should smile more, or try being less intense advice, wrapped in a tone that was never gentle, and Mom would watch the exchange with a small flinch in her eyes as she reached for the salt. Most days I swallowed it and kept eating. Then came the evening everything tipped. It was humid outside and thunder rolled somewhere far away, and Dad came home irritated that a client had chosen another broker, slamming the front door hard enough to shake the picture frames in the hall. Mom tried to ask how his day was, her voice thin and polite, and he snapped at her before she could finish calling her useless calling, her distracted raising his voice until it echoed in the kitchen. I stood up without fully thinking it through, stepping between them, telling him to stop telling him he could not talk to her that way, and for a moment he stared at me as if I had spoken in a language he did not recognize. Then his face flushed tight and dangerous, and he flung the glass in his hand toward the wall where it shattered in a burst of shards that rained down near my feet, close enough that a sliver nicked the skin above my ankle. Mom gasped and covered her mouth, and Maddie looked up from her phone with startled excitement, the kind that was half fear and half curiosity, the kind that meant someone would talk about this at school the next day. A neighbor must have heard the crash because within minutes the red and blue lights pulsed through the living room window, washing over the carpet, and 2 Charlotte officers stood at our doorway, asking if everything was all right. Dad's breath was still ragged, and Mom stood behind him, wringing her hands, and one officer asked if anyone was injured, looking at the broken glass, then at the scratch on my ankle, and he asked me if I wanted to tell them what happened. For one suspended second, I almost did. Almost said that this was not the first time something had flown across the room, almost said that Mom's hands only shook like that when she was frightened, almost said that the walls held more anger than laughter, the kind of truth that could break things open. Dad cut in before the words reached my tongue. He softened his voice, lowered his shoulders, painted exhaustion over his features, and told them work had been overwhelming, that he stumbled and the glass slipped, that there was no problem here, just a household dealing with stress, like everyone else. Mom nodded too quickly, agreeing with him, her voice trembling as she echoed the lie, and I felt the moment slip away like a door quietly closing. The officers exchanged a look. One scribbled something on a pad, then warned Dad to keep things under control, and left with their lights dimmed, their footsteps fading down the walk. When the door shut, Dad waited until the engines had turned the corner before he turned toward me, his expression no longer meek or apologetic. He stepped closer and said in a low voice that only I could hear, "If you ever open that mouth to cops again, I will make sure nobody believes you. Not now. Not later. Not ever." It was not shouted, not dramatic, but something in his tone curled cold around my spine, the way a hand might close around a throat without squeezing. After that night, I learned to read the signs of his temper, the way other girls read weather reports, adjusting myself before storms hit, keeping quiet to protect a mother who was always one apology away from tears, enduring the comments, the jabs, the long contaminated silences that made our home feel smaller than it was. Maddie glided past all of it untouched, stepping into her role as the bright daughter, the one Dad bragged about, the one teachers adored, while I morphed into the shadow version, the serious one, the one who overreacted, the one whose presence seemed to thicken the air. That dynamic settled into me like sediment, teaching me that speaking the truth had consequences that the world outside might help, but only if your own family was not willing to lie first, and I started carrying that understanding like a private weight. Many people watching my life from the outside thought I was quiet by nature, that I simply liked computers more than crowds, but the truth was quieter and heavier than that. I stayed silent because silence kept the house steady, because silence made me invisible enough not to provoke him, because silence was the only control I had in a place where every raised voice cost something. That year, I learned I was the wrong daughter in the Lockwood family, the one who took up too much space, felt too much, spoke too directly, the one who learned early how to swallow hurt without showing teeth. Somewhere inside that hurt, a resolve grew faint at first, but steady, a promise whispered only to myself that I would find a place where I was not an inconvenience, a place where rules did not change and truth mattered, a place where skill meant more than fear, a place where I could breathe without waiting for the next thing to break. By the fall of my senior year, the house felt smaller than ever, the walls holding the same stale air and the same unspoken rules, and I spent more time in the school computer lab than in my own bedroom, partly because the machines were faster, and partly because the quiet felt cleaner somehow. And it was in that lab where the guidance counselor, a tired but kind woman named Mrs. Paulson, asked what I planned to do after graduation, while she flipped through my test scores with a concentration that made me feel seen in a way I rarely did at home. She told me plainly that my aptitude for systems and logic was unusual, that cybersecurity was exploding as a field, and that the Army had one of the best training pipelines in the country, especially for students who needed structure funding and a career path that did not depend on parents who might not be able to pay for college. And when she mentioned the GI Bill and the possibility of entering a cyber program directly after basic training, something inside me sparked a quiet recognition that the world was bigger than Charlotte and bigger than the Lockwood house that had never felt like mine. I took the brochures home, tucked inside my backpack, rehearsing how I would tell my family, hoping maybe for once they would ask questions or show even a flicker of curiosity about something I cared about. But when I sat at the dinner table and said I was joining the Army Cyber Division, Dad let out a laugh so sharp it made my shoulders tighten, slapping his hand on the table as if I had told the punchline to a joke he had been waiting months to deliver. And he said, "You are signing up to be government property. Fantastic," as if my decision were a bad tattoo rather than a career. He kept going, leaning back in his chair with the self-satisfied posture of someone confident he was right, saying only kids with no future join, saying could not get into a real college, saying I was choosing the low road on purpose, while Mom picked at her food in silence and Maddie smirked into her phone before adding softly, "Guess some of us are meant for boardrooms, some for barracks," the words sliding out of her mouth like honey that had gone sour. I tried to explain that cyber operations were not what he thought, that the Army was building entire divisions to defend the country's infrastructure, that people with my skill set were needed. But he waved his hand and said I was making excuses for settling, claiming no serious university would want someone as intense as me, claiming he knew better what the world valued, and something inside me began to harden. Not with anger exactly, but with the realization that these people had already written my story for me, and they were not interested in revising it. A few days later, I was looking for tape in the kitchen junk drawer when I noticed a folded envelope tucked beneath an old grocery list, my name printed across the front. And when I pulled it out, the paper inside was a scholarship offer from Central Piedmont Community College, a modest award, but enough to make school possible, only it was creased and stained like someone had balled it up in a fist before dropping it into the trash, and the back of the envelope had bits of dried coffee grounds clinging to the edge. I stood there in the dim kitchen light, the smell of last night's leftovers thick in the air, realizing Dad had taken the letter from the mailbox, read it, and decided on my behalf that I did not need to see it, that if I thought I had choices, I might not bend the way he wanted that better to clip my wings before I even tried to fly. The knowledge slid through me like ice sharp and sobering, and in that moment the Army stopped being an option and became a decision, the only one that was truly mine. I scheduled my MEPS processing without telling anyone, drove myself to the center on a gray morning that smelled of rain, passed the tests, signed the papers, and stared at my own reflection in the mirrored hallway thinking, if my own home does not want me fine, I will build a new one in uniform. The day I shipped for basic training, Dad barely looked up from his laptop offering a half-hearted good luck that felt more like good riddance, while Mom hugged me with small, trembling hands and told me to take care of myself. Her voice wobbling like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing, and Maddie snapped a quick picture for social media with a caption I never saw, but imagined was something like, "My sister is off to play soldier." Basic training at Fort Jackson hit me like a storm. At first, the early morning wake-ups, the shouting drill sergeants, the heat pressing down on us like a second skin. But it also came with a strange clarity, a sense of purpose. I had never felt at home, and I found myself running harder, pushing further, refusing to fall behind because for the first time, failure was mine to own, and so was success. I learned to move with a squad, to trust my body even when my mind screamed, to stop, to shoot straight, to climb higher, to endure the gritty exhaustion that settled into my bones. At night and day by day, the fear shrank while something stronger took its place. In the cyber aptitude tests, I outscored most of the platoon, earning nods from instructors who otherwise barely spoke. And when graduation came, I stood in formation near the front, sweat trickling down my spine, heart pounding not from nerves, but from pride that felt new and startling. As the assignment sheets were handed out, I saw my name next to the words Fort Gordon and Cyber Operations Specialist, a path that would lead me into rooms where the stakes were far higher than any dinner table argument. And while the other recruits cheered or groaned or whispered about their future units, I folded my paper carefully and whispered to myself again that line that had carried me through the hardest days. If my own home does not want me fine, I will build a new one in uniform. Fort Gordon in 2016 did not look like the place where anyone would become a ghost in the nation's most guarded networks. It looked like rows of brick buildings baking under Georgia heat and long hallways that smelled faintly of coffee and burned wiring. Yet the moment I stepped into the cyber operations floors, I felt something settle in me, a quiet certainty that this was the first place in my life where what I carried inside my head mattered more than who I was at home. The classrooms were cramped, the screens were old, the fluorescent lights hummed with a rhythm that made everyone blink more than necessary. But I absorbed every line of code and every pattern of intrusion. Like oxygen staying late to dissect malware samples and chasing down anomalies. Not because anyone told me to, but because it felt like discovering a language I had always known, but never been taught. And soon the instructors realized I learned faster than they could assign tasks, sliding the more complicated packets across my desk with an approving nod. By the end of my first year, they started calling me Lock-a-Play on Lockwood, but also a quiet acknowledgement that I locked threats out, locked systems down, and locked myself into a rhythm that made me forget to eat until someone left a protein bar on my keyboard. When I moved to Fort Liberty, the pace quickened. The rooms grew darker with fewer windows, and the operations center felt like a sealed world, where the air itself carried tension screens, flickering with cascading logs, red alerts pulsing in corners. Analysts hunched over terminals while supervisors walked behind us with clipped footsteps and tighter voices. I felt myself sharpen in that environment, my movements more precise, my thinking quicker, as I chased down intrusions, reversed malicious code, and called out patterns others had missed, and the team learned to rely on me during night shifts when fatigue crept in and the wrong click could cost millions. Then came the night everything changed. It was after midnight when the first alert flashed across our screens, a spike in outbound traffic from a regional hospital network on the East Coast, a pattern too sudden and too clean to be anything but ransomware. And as more logs rolled in, we saw ICU monitors flicker, pharmacy systems freeze life support equipment, warnings stacking in a flood that turned the entire war room silent for one long, vibrating second. The threat was clear. If the malware spread, the ICUs would go dark, ventilators would fail, and the small blips of heartbeats on screens across multiple states would blink out something that hit the older analysts hard because they had parents in hospitals, spouses in recovery, neighbors, fighting illnesses, and even I felt my chest tighten as I imagined entire wings of patients depending on us. The supervisor barked for NSA liaison to get on the line, and suddenly the room erupted into motion chairs, scraping codes appearing on whiteboards, and I stepped into the center without being told, pulling the malware apart, piece by piece, mapping its propagation path, identifying the mutation routine guiding the team to isolate the infected segments, and calling out commands as the NSA techs fed real-time data through a secure bridge. Sweat ran down my back as the minutes collapsed into each other, my fingers flying across the keyboard, my voice steady even when the graphs spiked into dangerous ranges, and when the execution thread of the ransomware tried to latch onto the last clean server, I recognized the signature from an earlier sample we had studied in training, a weakness hidden in its encryption routine, and I slammed the fix into place with a patch that forced the malware into a loop long enough for the hospital system to cut all affected segments. The entire room held its breath as the ICU nodes stabilized one by one, flickering from red to amber to green. And when the final heartbeat line steadied, an analyst next to me let out a choked sigh, rubbing his eyes, and someone else whispered, "Thank you," under their breath, as if afraid speaking louder might break the fragile moment. By dawn, the attack was neutralized, and the hospitals were safe, and our team sat slumped at our stations, exhausted but wired with the knowledge that we had stopped something that could have become a national tragedy. A few hours later, the news channels broke into programming with a headline splashed across the screen: "Unnamed Army Cyber Team Stops Potential Catastrophe Anchors," talking about heroes behind locked doors, people praising the military for once, especially viewers over 50 who understood what it meant for ICU machines to keep humming because someone somewhere did their job. I sat in a windowless room with my badge clipped to my collar, hearing the world celebrate an invisible team, knowing that I had held the last failing thread in my hands, but also knowing I was not allowed to say a word to anyone, not even to my mother, who would have brushed off the call anyway. Not even to my father, who would have said government finally did its job for once took them long enough. Days later, there was a small internal ceremony in a sterile conference room that smelled faintly of cardboard and printer ink, and a 3-star general I had only seen on posters stood in front of us shaking hands and offering quiet thanks. Then he paused in front of me, pinned the Army Commendation Medal above my left pocket, and said, "One day, people will know what you did for them, for now I do." His voice softened by something like pride, and in the back of the room, General Helena Stratford, still a lieutenant general, then watched with an expression so unreadable it steadied me more than any medal. When I finally took leave and returned home to Charlotte, I sat on the old sofa in the living room, the fabric scratched from years of wear, watching the news replay the headline that blurred us into a nameless unit, and Dad walked by holding a cup of coffee, muttering government finally did something right for a change, without once glancing at me, without once imagining his daughter had been the one typing through the night to keep half the region breathing. I sat there with the glow of the TV flickering across my face, feeling something rise in me, something like quiet triumph mixed with a familiar ache, realizing that the world had seen the impact of my work, even if the people in this house never did, and in that moment I felt both invisible and powerful, the ghost behind the firewall who saved lives while her own family never even looked her way. By 2021, the rhythm of my life had become a steady pulse of encrypted briefings, overnight shifts in operations centers, and quiet commendations that never reached outside walls, protected by layers of clearance. Yet something in me kept reaching upward, not out of ambition exactly, but out of the sense that every hour I poured into this work mattered, that the country trusted people like me, even when my own family did not. When my commander pulled me aside and told me I had been selected for OCS, I felt the floor tilt beneath me in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating, because officer training meant leadership responsibility and the possibility of shaping the way cyber operations functioned in a world where threats evolve faster than most people could blink. OCS was grueling in a different way than basic training had been, more mental than physical. The kind of program where you were judged not just on how you ran or how you shot, but on how you thought, how you led, how you steadied other people when everything was moving too fast. I pushed through it with the same quiet determination that had carried me from the halls of Fort Gordon into the deeper layers of Fort Liberty. And when I graduated and pinned on second lieutenant bars, I felt a small spark of pride that no one could take away, not even Dad with his dismissive comments, and Maddie with her bright future curated perfectly for social media. The promotions came faster than anyone expected, each one tied not to luck, but to the record. I had built the night spent tracing hostile code through networks that were supposed to be impenetrable. The incidents I neutralized before anyone outside the defense world even knew there had been danger. And by the time I reached captain, I was younger than most officers at that rank. Young enough that people sometimes did a double take when they saw the combination of my age and my clearance. General Helena Stratford stepped into my life with the same calm authority she had shown on my father's lawn years later. though at the time she was still a lieutenant general, already a legend in cyber command circles, known for seeing potential in people before they saw it in themselves, and she began pulling me into meetings I had never imagined attending, introducing me to analysts, strategists, and high-level planners whose names appeared only in internal memos. She placed me on a joint cyber task force, a group designed to bridge military intelligence, homeland security, and NSA operations, something so sensitive that even discussing the structure required a sealed room. Working under her was like stepping into a different climate, one where excellence was expected, and excuses were irrelevant, and I found myself rising to every challenge she set. Memorizing threat maps, analyzing adversary capabilities, learning how to speak in brief, direct sentences that captured the urgency of a situation without slipping into panic. In early 2023, I received a notice that I was to travel to the Pentagon for a classified briefing, something I had imagined but never allowed myself to believe would actually happen, and I arrived in Washington on a cold morning with my uniform pressed so sharply it felt like armor. The Pentagon felt like a world made of edges and echoes, long corridors, where footsteps sounded important, whether or not they were. And when I stepped into the secure conference room, I realized I was the youngest person in the room by at least a decade, a fact that pressed against my ribs with a mix of pride and pressure. Maps of network activity glowed across the walls. Color-coded threat indicators pulsed like heartbeats, and as representatives from branches across the military took their seats, something inside me steadied, because for once the age difference did not matter. Only the work did. When it was my turn to brief, I stood at the podium, the screen behind me scrolling with code signatures and intercept data, and I walked them through the vulnerability we had discovered in a foreign adversary's intrusion toolkit, explaining how it could be exploited, how it could spread, and how our countermeasures could neutralize it. My voice clear and even as I answered questions from people whose insignia carried decades of experience. When the briefing ended, the room fell into a low murmur of technical discussion, and I stepped back, letting the next officer take the floor, my heart still beating fast but my hands steady. General Stratford approached me as the room cleared and waited until the last officer left before saying quietly that if I were her daughter, she would brag about me to anyone who would listen her voice, carrying a warmth that pierced deeper than she probably intended, stirring a place in me I had spent years sealing off. I thanked her, unable to fully speak around the sudden lump in my throat, and she rested a hand briefly on my shoulder before turning away, giving me space to gather myself. When I returned to Charlotte for a short weekend months later, I sat on the same sofa where I had once watched the news report on the unnamed cyber team. My uniform hung neatly in the guest room, because Mom insisted it made her nervous when I wore it in the house, and Maddie breezed through the doorway in a fitted blazer, waving her phone excitedly, as she announced she had been promoted to senior marketing manager. The family group chat erupted with congratulations. Aunts and uncles posted comments about how proud they were, and Dad called me that evening not to ask about my trip to Washington, nor about the work I was doing, but to say your sister is killing it out here, real-world rewards, real work. A sentence that tightened something in my chest as I forced out a quiet congratulations. He asked what I had been up to, and I said just work because the truth was classified, and the people on the other end of the line had never cared enough to ask beyond the surface anyway. And as I hung up, I thought again of General Stratford's words, "If you were my daughter," and felt that old wound ache with a familiarity that made my breath catch. It was a strange thing to be trusted with national secrets and still feel like a disappointment in the one place where nothing you did was ever enough. A contradiction so sharp it left a mark, and as I stared at the ceiling that night, I realized that some families never see you, no matter how brightly you shine, that some homes stay dark, no matter how many lights you keep on for them, and that the only path forward was the one I had been carving for myself all along, steady and silent and strong. By early December of 2024, the air around Fort Liberty carried the brittle cold that settled into the metal of the fences and the concrete walkways. a sharpness that reminded me winter was always harsher on bases, because silence echoed more loudly there, and inside the operations building. The lights hummed as I stared at a cluster of threat indicators crawling across the screen, each one representing a probing attempt against the power grid in North Carolina, a pattern subtle enough that a less experienced analyst might have overlooked it. But the cadence of the packets made my stomach tighten because it looked too familiar, too deliberate, too close to the kind of coordinated intrusion that could take down a regional grid and plunge entire counties into darkness. I leaned closer, tracing the signatures with a finger against the glass, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavier, because this was my home state, the place where my mother made cornbread on Sundays, where my father grumbled at the TV, where the power flickering would not just be a statistic, but a reality for people I had grown up with. And for one brief moment, I wondered if my family would even notice if their lights dimmed, or if they would blame the government, and never imagine their own daughter was one of the people racing to keep that from happening. As I assembled the assessment package, my phone vibrated with a message from General Stratford's aide instructing me to report to her office immediately, and the brisk walk down the hallway steadied me, because I knew she never called for anything trivial. When I entered her office, she was standing by the window, hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight, even in the dim of late afternoon, and she turned with that measured calm that made everyone else in the room hold their breath. She reviewed my grid analysis with swift precision, asking 2 questions that cut straight to the heart of the threat, and when I answered, she nodded slowly, as though confirming something she'd already suspected. Then she told me that my name had been placed into consideration for a pre-selection process, an elite pathway meant for officers who demonstrated strategic capability beyond their years, the kind of track that could put me on a list for positions normally reserved for seasoned majors, perhaps even set a trajectory toward becoming a lieutenant colonel before 35, a timeline so rare it almost felt unreal. Hearing her say it made my throat tighten, because it was the first time someone had articulated the thing I had been quietly fighting. For the recognition that my work was not only useful, but exceptional. And I stood there feeling something warm, bloom in my chest, a sense that I was finally stepping into a future I had carved with years of sacrifice and silence. That night in the barracks, the glow of the overhead light looked softer somehow, the hum of the heating vents sounding almost like applause, and I sat on my bed, rereading the notes she had given me, imagining a life where the higher ranks were within reach, where command seats might someday bear my name, where all the nights spent hunched over terminals had led to something more than exhaustion. I was halfway through drafting an email to thank her when my phone rang the caller ID showing my mother's number, and for a second I considered letting it go to voicemail, but some old habit made me swipe to answer. Her voice came through thin and wavering, the kind of tremor that made my shoulders lock because I knew this tone, the one she used when she was caught between loyalty and fear, and she said, "Your father says if you do not come home this Christmas, do not bother coming back at all." The words hit harder than I expected, not because I believed him, but because I had almost allowed myself to forget how conditional love felt in that house. How affection came with strings, tied so tightly they cut into your wrists. She added, "Please just come for me," as though she already knew how unreasonable his ultimatum was, and needed me to soothe the guilt she never fully confronted. And I sat there staring at the metal frame of my bunk, feeling the warmth from earlier drain out of me. I told her I would think about it, my voice steady, because the Army had taught me steadiness, even when I ached inside. And after we hung up, I felt the familiar heaviness return, that sinking sense that no matter how high I climbed, my family would always pull me backward toward the person they believed me to be. I went to the chaplain's office the next afternoon, the small room lit by a single lamp and smelling faintly of coffee and old paper, and he listened as I described the years of being dismissed, the broken glass, the insults that had shaped me. The dismissive laughter, the way my father's voice always made me shrink even now, and I admitted quietly that sometimes the idea of home still tugged at me, even when home had never been soft or safe. He folded his hands and told me gently that I was allowed to choose where my family ended, that blood did not grant unlimited access to my life, that boundaries were not betrayals, but necessities, and that going home out of guilt was not the same as going home out of love. His words settled into me like stones dropped in water, rippling outward, steady and true, and for a moment I felt the possibility of choosing myself instead of them. Yet when I returned to my room and saw the small Christmas card taped to my locker from a junior soldier who said I had helped her pass her certification exam, something inside me softened, reminding me of the part of me that always hoped people could be better than their worst moments, and I made a decision that surprised even me. I would go home one more time, not because my father demanded it, but because some small part of me needed to see if anything had changed, needed to know whether I could sit at that table without folding into myself again. Even as I packed a small bag, I felt the ache of predictability, the way so many people drift back to the places that hurt them, because they want closure, because they want proof that the pain was not their fault. And I knew that viewers who had lived long enough to be disappointed by their own families would understand that feeling, the tender hope that maybe this year things would be different. The house looked almost picturesque from the outside. When I pulled into the driveway on Christmas Eve, the kind of suburban holiday scene people put on postcards, lights strung along the gutters wreath on the door, a tall tree glittering in the living room window. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the same hollowness I had known since childhood, because warmth had never lived here, no matter how many ornaments my mother hung or how many candles she lit. The air smelled of cinnamon and ham and something sweet, cooling on the counter, yet beneath it was the low tension I recognized immediately, the kind that lingered between people who pretended everything was fine, even when the truth pulsed under every conversation. And as relatives filled the house with coats and chatter, I stood near the doorway wondering why I still expected anything different. Dad moved through the living room like a host at a networking event, hand on shoulders, voice loud, showing off the new renovations he had financed on credit. And when he spotted Maddie arriving in a chic red dress, he lit up as though a celebrity had walked in, pulling her toward the guests while saying, "Our marketing star is here, 6-figure salary." Real career pride coating his voice in a way he had never used with me. People I barely remembered hugged me politely, asking how long I was in town where I was stationed now, and before I could answer, Dad would cut in with Sheeta's computer stuff for the Army. Nothing you would recognize as a real job, a line that made a few guests laugh awkwardly as though they were not sure if he was joking or if they were supposed to join in. And every time he said it, the sting deepened, even though I kept my face still. During dinner, the table stretched long and crowded plates past hand-to-hand silverware, clinking the Christmas playlist, looping in the background. Yet every few minutes someone launched a small jab in my direction that felt almost rehearsed, like a family tradition I had not agreed to but was expected to participate in. One aunt looked at my empty ring finger and asked, "Still single, honey busy, marrying the Army?" And Maddie laughed softly behind her napkin, not maliciously perhaps, but with the ease of someone who had never been on the receiving end of these digs. Another uncle joked, "Do not bring any classified drama to the table, we just want turkey," while someone else muttered, "At least Maddie is not hiding behind clearance," as if secrecy were a personal failing rather than a requirement of my job. And each comment sliced lightly, but repeatedly, until the cuts felt raw. I sat there, my posture straight, because years in uniform had taught me how to hold myself when I wanted to curl inward, and I tried to focus on my mother's gentle attempts at conversation, on the smell of the tree, on the tiny lights reflecting in the silverware, anything to keep my mind from spiraling into the familiar conviction that nothing I had achieved mattered here. Dessert plates clattered softly as my mother brought out pie and cookies, and for a moment I allowed myself to think the evening might taper into something tolerable. But then I saw Dad stand up at the head of the table with that particular glint in his eye, the one that meant he was gearing up for a performance, and the room quieted in that expectant way. People fall silent when they sense a show coming. He reached for his wallet with exaggerated slowness, patting his pockets as though searching for something important, then pulled it out and flipped it open, looking directly at me with a smile that made my stomach twist, and he said in a voice loud enough for the entire table, "We poured 18 years into you, Avery, 18 years of food and clothes and gas and everything else, and it turns out you are a $12 mistake." He drew out a crumpled 10 and 2 ones, smoothed them theatrically, then tossed them onto the table in front of me, where they landed beside my plate with a faint slap, and the sound seemed to echo inside my chest as though my heart had cracked. Maddie lifted her phone recording without shame. A few cousins laughed nervously. An uncle coughed and looked away, and not a single person said, "Stop." Not one person told him to sit down or leave me alone. The room complicit in its silence, just as it had been for years, and I felt something inside me fold in on itself, not breaking exactly, but hardening in a way that would not soften again. I wanted to stand and shout. I briefed the Joint Chiefs. "You have no idea who I am out there. You have no idea what I have stopped or saved." I wanted to hurl every classified triumph I had ever carried alone, to lay them before him, like proof that I was not the disappointment he had always painted me to be. But clearance wrapped itself around my throat like a command, and the words locked behind my teeth. Instead, I picked up the bills, with 2 fingers smoothing them the way he had, but my hand was steady, and my breathing had evened out because somewhere in the back of my mind, a clarity was forming, a certainty that the life I was building had nothing to do with the people at this table. I set the money back in front of him, quietly placing it beside his plate, and said, "One day you will find out how cheap that sounds to the people who sign my orders." My voice calm in a way that startled even me, and for a moment the entire table froze as though the air itself had shifted. Dad's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but he recovered with a scoff and a wave of his hand telling everyone she is sensitive. "Do not mind her yet." The moment hung in the room like a hairline crack that would later split wide open. As the conversations resumed in forced tones and people pretended to go back to their pie, I sat there tasting metal in my mouth, realizing that the daughter they believed they could belittle into smallness had already grown past the boundaries of this house, and that the humiliation he intended as entertainment was about to become the last straw in a story he never imagined he would not control. The cold wrapped around me the moment I stepped out of the house, the kind of sharp winter air that sliced through my coat and stung my lungs as I exhaled a stream of white fog, and for a second I stood on the porch, gripping the railing, willing myself not to cry, because tears felt like something my father would claim as proof that I could not handle real-life proof, that his insults were carved truth instead of wounds he inflicted, and behind me I heard the door creak open again as he leaned out his silhouette framed by warm indoor light while I stood in the dark. He shouted after me, "Run back to your little base soldier girl. That is the only place you are worth more than pocket change." His voice carrying across the cul-de-sac with the ease of a man who never imagined his words would echo back at him, and I felt my shoulders tense, because even after everything he had said at the table, something in me still reacted to that tone, the tone of a father mocking a daughter he had never bothered to understand. I stepped onto the driveway, hearing the crunch of frost under my boots, and for a moment the street was still and silent, except for the faint hum of Christmas lights strung across neighboring homes. Then a sudden blaze of white headlights flooded the dark, bright enough to wash out the colors of the houses and cast long shadows across the pavement. 3 black SUVs rolled into the cul-de-sac in a slow, deliberate formation, their engines low and controlled, and I felt my breath catch because I recognized that pattern, immediately recognized the subtle signals in the way they positioned themselves, and I realized that whatever this was, it had not been planned lightly. The SUVs stopped in front of the house doors, clicking open in near-perfect unison, and my father stepped back into the doorway with a confused, "What on earth" expression That might have been comical if the moment were not so deadly serious. From the center vehicle, General Helena Stratford emerged, her service uniform, pressed metals gleaming even under the harsh headlights, her presence so commanding that the air itself seemed to adjust to her, and behind her, 2 military police officers stepped out, their posture straight, their eyes scanning, without moving their heads much, the kind of discipline you could not fake. My father blurted out something like, "Ma'am, is there some problem in the neighborhood?" as if he were the authority here, as if she had come to ask him for permission to exist on this street. And I almost laughed at the absurdity, because the contrast between the power she carried and the weakness he hid behind volume could not have been greater. General Stratford did not look at him first. She looked at me, stepping forward with a steadiness that made my throat tighten, and she said, "Captain Lockwood, you missed our check-in." I came myself, her voice even, but edged with concern, the kind of concern only someone who actually valued my presence would carry. My father inserted himself immediately with, "She is in the middle of something family talk," as though he had any authority over my movements, as though my rank and responsibilities evaporated the moment I stepped into his house, and the general turned her head slowly toward him, the kind of slow that communicated both control and disbelief. Family does not put a price tag on their children. She said each word sharp enough to cut, and I saw my father's face twitch, not with shame exactly, but with the shock of someone unaccustomed to being corrected by anyone he considered above him in ego, but below him in his own imagined hierarchy. She stepped closer to him, her eyes unwavering, and continued, "This woman stopped a cyber attack that would have turned this entire state dark last summer. You called that a mistake." Her voice rising only slightly, but enough that every porch light in the neighborhood felt suddenly brighter enough that the truth of her words seemed to vibrate in the air. My father glanced at me, then a brief flicker of realization crossing his features, not full recognition of my worth, but recognition that he had said something deeply wrong to someone who wielded real authority, and before he could respond, she issued the command that would fracture every illusion he had ever held about control. "Everyone kneel now." She said the words ringing through the cul-de-sac with the sharp clarity of an order that did not need repeating, and though no one physically dropped to their knees, the silence that followed was its own form of submission. Neighbors peeking through curtains, my father's posture collapsing a fraction, my mother stepping out behind him with trembling hands, Maddie lowering her phone in shock as though suddenly aware she had been recording a reality she did not know how to process. The 2 MPs stood unmoving. The SUVs hummed quietly, and even the wind seemed to pause, the symbolic kneel filling the space with a tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. And in that moment, everything tilted, everything shifted because authority had changed hands, and my father finally felt small. From across the street, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a teenager, maybe 17, standing on his driveway, with his phone raised, recording the scene with the kind of stunned fascination that comes from witnessing something extraordinary. And I heard him whisper a caption under his breath before uploading the clip my neighbor just got wrecked by a 4-star general for insulting his own daughter. His voice half startled and half thrilled. The video uploaded instantly, casting itself into the current of local TikTok feeds, spreading from one screen to another, long before anyone inside my house understood what had just begun. And though it had not yet gone national, it did not need to, because the town was small and church communities were connected and Dad's clients were local, and nothing stays quiet in places like this during the holidays. I stood there as the general placed a steady hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward the SUV. And for the first time in years, I let myself breathe deeply, the cold air filling my chest without the weight of humiliation pressing down on it, because I knew that everything had changed, and the story my father had built about me had shattered in front of the people he most wanted to impress. The week after Christmas unfolded with a strange quiet that felt almost detached from the chaos of the night before, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from a shift in the air, a subtle realignment of how people looked at each other. And at Maple Ridge, that shift became almost tangible. As neighbors who once waved warmly at my father began to offer only stiff nods or averted eyes, their smiles replaced by something flat and unreadable. I stayed at Fort Liberty during that week, returning to routine operations, diving into reports and threat assessments, as though the work could buffer me from the lingering sting of Christmas Eve. Yet every so often my phone buzzed with a new message from someone back home saying, "Have you seen this?" attaching another clip or another screenshot of the video taken by the teenager across the street. A video that was spreading faster than anyone expected in a community that thrived on word of mouth. In the footage, Dad looked small, defensive, almost childish under the blast of the headlights, his voice unmistakable when he barked that I was worth only pocket change, and when General Stratford delivered her command with the force of someone who did not tolerate cruelty. The comment section erupted with a chorus of people who had no patience for his excuses, people who did not need context, because the words themselves told the entire story. Back in Maple Ridge, my father began his predictable campaign to reshape the narrative drifting between houses, with the same false humility he used when clients grew upset with him, telling neighbors that the general had overreacted, that kids these days were too sensitive, and took everything as an attack, that he had been joking and people needed to learn how to laugh. And he repeated this so often that I could practically hear his voice in my mind, that condescending tone that insisted he was the victim whenever he felt cornered. What he did not realize was that his audience had already seen the unfiltered version, the raw humiliation he had inflicted on me at the dinner table. The crumpled bills tossed with casual cruelty, the way he spoke over me as though I did not exist. And more importantly, they had seen the absolute authority in the general's voice when she defended me, the clarity with which she named my work and called out his failure as a father. And no matter how many times he tried to retell the story, the clip held more truth than his words ever could. The neighbors in our cul-de-sac were mostly in their 50s and 60s, people who valued respect and responsibility, and who had raised children of their own, and they reacted the way older Americans often do when they witness a parent devalue their child, their disapproval sharp and unrestrained, their boundaries suddenly firm. Overnight, the casual friendliness that had once surrounded him cooled into polite distance invitations from the church committee quietly excluded him. People who had once referred clients to his insurance office suddenly hesitated, saying they just were not sure anymore, because if a man could demean his own daughter so easily, what would he do to a customer who trusted him with something as important as coverage? At the Sunday service the following week, he walked into the sanctuary with my mother beside him, both trying to appear composed. And though no one said a word to them at first, when the pastor stood at the pulpit and delivered a sermon about valuing your children, about understanding the weight of your words and the responsibility of parenthood, nearly every head in the congregation turned toward him with quiet accusation. My mother kept her eyes down, twisting the corner of her bulletin until it frayed, and Dad sat rigid in the pew, his jaw tight, pretending not to notice the glances. He must have been furious, but fury could not drown out the realities of a community that had already decided he had crossed a line that decent parents simply did not cross. At the insurance office, the fallout deepened. Clients began canceling or transferring their policies, citing discomfort, or simply failing to return calls. And new clients stopped coming altogether because people in small towns hear stories quickly, especially ones involving humiliation in front of a 4-star general, and the notion that a man who belittled his own daughter would also mishandle someone else's needs became a quiet but powerful undercurrent that undermined his business without me lifting a single finger. That was the part that struck me most as I watched from a distance how the consequences grew not from anything I said or did, but from his own words reverberating through the town, amplified by a moment he thought he controlled until the truth swallowed him whole. I did not post the video, I did not share it, I did not apply pressure. And General Stratford told me in her steady, measured voice that sometimes justice is just letting people hear themselves, that the echo of their actions becomes its own verdict. And I found myself replaying that idea as I received yet another message from a former classmate who wrote, "I never knew what you went through, but now I understand why you left so early." The hidden revenge unfolded with such quiet force that even I felt unsettled by how effective it was, how the same man who had always prided himself on appearances could not escape the reflection he had created the moment he threw $12 on a dinner table. And as the week stretched on, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction, because none of this erased the pain he had caused. Yet it revealed something important, something liberating, the truth that I no longer had to fight for the world to see what he had done. The world had seen it for themselves. By the first weeks of 2025, the quiet social unraveling that had begun in Maple Ridge hardened into something more dangerous for my father, a slow tightening around his business that he could neither name nor control. And while I stayed at Fort Liberty focusing on cyber operations, the updates drifting back to me painted a clear picture of a man scrambling to hold together a life built on image rather than integrity. Customers had stopped calling, referrals dried up, and overdue notices piled in his mailbox until the stack leaned like a tired spine, and with mortgage payments creeping toward delinquency and credit card balances ballooning, he grew more frantic, cutting corners in ways he had resisted before, desperate to prove to himself that he was still in control despite the shrinking world around him. At the insurance office, he began taking on clients he normally would have screened out, promising unrealistic coverage-bending rules in the hope of boosting his numbers, and sometime in late February, he crossed the line that people in his industry whispered about but never admitted outright when he altered a set of claim documents for a long-standing client, adjusting the reported damage numbers to secure a higher payout and patch a gap in his own commission reports, telling himself it was harmless, that no one would track it closely, that he deserved the break after how hard life had become. What he did not understand, because he never bothered to learn anything beyond his own small circle, was that digital fraud detection had grown sharper than he realized, that systems built by agencies he mocked endlessly were designed to catch anomalies exactly like the one he had created, and within days the algorithm flagged the claim, cross-referenced the metadata, and sent a red-coded notification into a federal review queue. I knew none of this when it first happened, not until weeks later when our team at Fort Liberty was asked to support a different agency on an emerging fraud analysis project, the task involving de-identified data sets from small independent insurance offices across several states' patterns that suggested coordinated misuse of reporting tools. And I sat at my workstation scrolling through columns of anonymized figures, scanning IP clusters, and timestamps the work routine enough that I almost fell into a rhythm. Then I saw a set of entries that made something in my chest constrict, not because the numbers looked dangerous, but because the structure of the company name jumped out even through the anonymization, the formatting of the address fields, the pattern of abbreviation, the way only my father insisted on writing sweet instead of tiny quirks that should not have meant anything but meant everything when you grew up seeing them on envelopes in the kitchen mail pile. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath steadying as I traced the identifiers through the internal mapping tool, and the confirmation hit me like a cold gust when the system revealed the underlying entry, Lockwood Insurance, flagged for irregularities and scheduled for further review, sitting there in a sea of other cases, but glowing in my mind like a flare. For a long, quiet moment, I stared at the name, feeling a pull like two tides moving in opposite directions, one pushing me toward the instinct to protect blood, the old reflex that whispered, "He is your father," the other pulling harder with the reminder of every insult, every bruise on memory, every moment he twisted truth to save himself at the expense of someone else, and I felt myself balanced between them with the weight of my uniform settling onto my shoulders. I knew what it would take to intervene: a few keystrokes, a masked override, a deletion, buried so deep it would never be traced. And the temptation flickered, not because I wanted to save him, but because it would have been easy. Too easy, the kind of shadow line some people crossed without blinking, and the knowledge that I could made my pulse pick up as I realized what choosing to cross it would mean for me. If I erased his mistake, I would become exactly the kind of person he always accused me of being: someone who hid behind systems, someone who twisted rules, someone who could not succeed without manipulating the world around them, and the thought made something sour rise in my throat. I sat back, the hum of the server room faint through the walls, and whispered to myself, I will not touch it. I will not become the kind of person he thinks I am. And in saying it, I felt a kind of release, a decision that closed one door firmly and left another open toward a life where my integrity mattered more than the man who never saw it. So I flagged the data set for further review like protocol required, sent my portion of the analysis to the lead agency, and walked away from the terminal with my spine straighter, my heartbeat steady, carrying no guilt, because I had simply let the system work the way it was designed. Back in Maple Ridge, the consequences arrived with the cold precision of a machine letters, summoning my father for questioning subpoenas, requesting financial documents, emails from investigators requesting access to archived client files. And the more he tried to explain, the more inconsistencies surfaced, each discrepancy widening the crack he had created with that single fraudulent alteration. His reputation, already weakened by the Christmas Eve fallout, took another sharp blow as word spread quietly through the small business community that he was under review, and clients who had once trusted him with their policies now whispered concerns about integrity, about reliability, about whether they could trust a man who cut corners when the pressure mounted. What struck me most was how little I had done, how the universe seemed to reveal itself in slow, patient arcs that required no force from me, and I understood more clearly than ever why General Stratford's words had settled so deeply in me. The idea that justice sometimes required nothing more than stepping back and letting truth do its work, because truth moved with a weight and direction no one could escape, not even someone who believed himself untouchable. By early spring of 2025, the tension around my father's investigation had thickened into something heavy and unavoidable, a pressure that seeped into every conversation in Maple Ridge, and though I kept my focus on operations at Fort Liberty, I could sense the unraveling from miles away because the calls from my mother grew shorter, my father's messages more frantic, and Maddie's social media updates more strained, yet none of them mentioned the investigation, directly choosing instead to dance around it until the silence became its own admission. I was not surprised when the front desk at Fort Liberty called to inform me that 3 civilians were requesting temporary base access under my name. But the moment I heard the staff sergeant describe them, a man in his late 50s with a rigid posture, a woman clutching a purse as though it were a lifeline, and a younger woman with a tablet tucked under her arm, my stomach tightened because I knew exactly who they were long before he said the names. The request alone was surreal because Fort Liberty was not the sort of place civilians casually walked into, the layers of security designed to keep operations contained. Yet here they were. My family standing at the gate of the institution they had mocked for years, suddenly treating it like a sanctuary, or more accurately, a lifeboat. I walked toward the security checkpoint with measured steps, the hum of the badge scanner echoing faintly as I approached. And the moment I turned the corner, I saw them lined up in front of the glass booth, dressed more formally than I had seen them in years, my father in a stiff-collared shirt, my mother in a blouse too thin for the wind, Maddie in a blazer, as though professionalism could mask desperation, and for a heartbeat, none of them moved, each one frozen in the realization that they were on my turf now, not theirs. My father was the first to speak, his voice pitched in a tone meant to sound calm but cracking. Underneath saying, "We just need to talk to you, sweetheart," as though sweetness had ever been the currency between us, and the security officer looked at me for confirmation, before allowing them to proceed through the checkpoint with visitor badges that hung awkwardly around their necks. Their eyes darted around the base as we walked, taking in the soldiers jogging along the path, the passing tactical vehicles, the flag snapping sharply in the wind, and I could see the dawning awareness settle over them, the understanding that this world respected me in a way they never had, and that they had arrived not out of love or pride, but necessity. I led them into a small visitor conference room with plain walls, a metal table, and 4 chairs a space. Intentionally neutral, intentionally unadorned, designed to level the field. And when we sat down, my father immediately leaned forward, adopting the tone he used with insurance customers when he wanted to sound wronged, telling me the investigation was a misunderstanding, that the system had singled him out unfairly, that it was all a minor error blown out of proportion. He gestured animatedly, claiming stress and workload, painting himself as the victim of bureaucratic incompetence. And my mother nodded along. Timidly, her eyes red as though she had cried all morning, while Maddie folded her arms and tried to appear composed, even as her voice trembled when she said, "You are in that cyber stuff. Can't you just make this go away because you know how these things work, don't you?" The words hit me with a strange mix of disappointment and inevitability, because even here, sitting in the heart of the institution they had always dismissed, they still expected me to bend the world to accommodate their mistakes, and none of them offered an apology. Not one acknowledged the Christmas humiliation or the years of disregard, choosing instead to frame the conversation as an obligation, as though family loyalty required me to undo the consequences of their own decisions. Then my father said, the line that crystallized the moment into something both absurd and infuriating, "We raised you, fed you, clothed you. You owe us the words," spilling out with a righteousness that made the room feel smaller. And I felt something inside me quiet, a kind of cold, steady resolve rising where hurt used to be. Without speaking, I reached into my briefcase and placed several items on the table one by one, letting each object land softly but with weight. First, the printed copy of the fraud complaint, the official letterhead stark against the cheap wood. Then the internal article summarizing my cyber accomplishments, the one naming me indirectly as a key asset in multiple classified operations. And finally, slowly, the $10 bill and 2 ones from Christmas night, pressed flat and kept in my wallet, not as sentiment, but as a reminder. My family stared at the items, confusion flickering across their faces, and I finally spoke, my voice calm but unwavering, telling them, "You priced me at $12 that night, and that is all I ever owed you. I paid that debt when you threw it at my plate." The silence that followed, stretching taut across the room, as if the walls themselves were listening. My father opened his mouth as though to argue, but the words tangled in his throat. My mother's hands trembled around her purse strap, and Maddie's jaw clenched as she looked down at the table, her composure cracking for the first time since they arrived, and I could see each of them realizing that the leverage they believed they had evaporated the moment they walked through the gate. I slid a folder toward them, inside it a list of legal aid offices, financial counselors and attorneys who specialized in small business fraud, explaining that this was everything a stranger would receive from me, and that I was not allowed ethically or legally to give more to people who had never treated me as their daughter, my voice steady, not out of rehearsed confidence, but out of clarity. My father's face shifted from pleading to anger in seconds, his volume rising as he insisted I was abandoning them, that family stood together, that I was ungrateful, and the rising pitch triggered a knock on the door from security, who asked calmly if everything was all right, their presence alone enough to remind him that this was not his house and not his rules. When he continued to raise his voice, the security staff stepped in, firm but respectful, escorting them out. As my mother cried softly, my father barked accusations, and Maddie stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and something like fear, and I remained seated, breathing evenly, watching as the door closed behind them with a quiet click. For the first time in my life, they realized the cord they had used to pull me back for years had finally been cut, not in anger, but in certainty, and the consequences waiting for them outside the base were theirs alone to carry. The invitation arrived on a cold, gray Monday morning, sealed in a thick envelope embossed with a golden crest, and when I tore it open at my desk in Fort Liberty, I felt the air shift because the words inside carried the weight of a country, not just a commendation, but a summons to testify before a congressional hearing on national cyber defense, a moment that only came to a handful of officers in a generation. And for a long breath, I simply stared at my name, printed above the title Witness, Captain Avery Lockwood, United States Army, feeling the strange mixture of disbelief and inevitability threading through my chest, as though every moment since basic training had led here without me ever realizing it. General Stratford called me into her office before I even had a chance to compose myself, her expression calm yet proud, telling me that the committee wanted a first-hand account of the operations that had saved the Eastern power grid in the summer, and that it was time the country knew the face of the quiet mind behind the firewall. Her voice steady as she added that I would be stepping onto a stage where service met history, and that she trusted no one else to do it. The days leading up to the hearing moved in a blur of preparation security briefings, rehearsed lines and procedural guidelines, each step underscoring the gravity of the event. And by the time I boarded the military transport to Washington, D.C., the magnitude had settled into my bones, not as fear, but as clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when the truth is finally allowed to breathe. When I walked into the hearing chamber, the room was already filled with murmurs, cameras and lawmakers in dark suits, the atmosphere tense, yet charged with purpose, and I felt the weight of every eye as General Stratford escorted me to the witness table, her medals catching the light with a quiet authority that steadied my breath. She stood behind the microphone, first her voice resonant and unwavering as she introduced me to the panel and the nation, saying, "This is Captain Avery Lockwood, the mind behind operations that kept your lights on when you had no idea they were under attack," her tone leaving no room for doubt, and the pause afterward made the room lean forward as though collectively inhaling. When she stepped back, I moved to the microphone, the wood beneath my hands smooth and cool, the cameras blinking red like small, steady hearts, and I began with the sentence that had lived in my chest since Christmas night. Someone I loved once told me I was a $12 mistake that night. I decided my value would never again be set at a dinner table, the words flowing with a quiet force that surprised even me, because they carried 10 years of silence, 10 years of endurance, 10 years of choosing duty over bitterness. I did not name my father or my family. I did not offer details. I simply spoke the truth of what it meant to serve in the shadows to protect people who would never know your name, to hold the line while others slept, and the room grew so still that even the camera shutters seemed to pause, the lawmakers listening with a seriousness that made the entire moment feel suspended in time. As I outlined the threat, the countermeasures, and the decisive steps that prevented a blackout across North Carolina, and beyond the gravity of what had almost happened, hung in the air, and when a congressman turned to his microphone and stated for the record that Captain Lockwood's actions prevented billions in damage nationwide and preserved essential services for millions, including her own home state, I felt a tremor of emotion I had not expected, because those words were not just acknowledgement but vindication. While I spoke in D.C., the Lockwood living room in Charlotte flickered with the same broadcast on an old TV perched atop a wobbly stand, the room dim, the furniture worn a far cry from the decorated space I had grown up in, and my father sat hunched on the sagging sofa with the remote clenched tightly in his hand, while my mother perched beside him with her shoulders drawn inward, and Maddie leaned forward with her arms wrapped around herself, all three of them watching me in my dress uniform ribbons-aligned posture, straight face, calm as my accomplishments filled the room they now struggled to afford. The camera cut to a close shot of my face, the lighting in the chamber highlighting the steadiness in my eyes, and in Charlotte, My father's hand trembled so violently that the remote hit the floor as the congressman repeated the scale of the prevented attack, emphasizing that the person sitting before them had shielded the entire state from disaster, including the very neighborhoods my family lived in, the very grid that powered their home, their jobs, their lives, the very stability my father once used to posture as a provider. The irony settled heavily over the living room, like a cold draft, because while he had called me a $12 mistake, I had been the unseen barrier protecting everything he valued, and for the first time the weight of that reality pressed against his expression, his jaw slackening as the truth replaced the narrative he had clung to for years. Across Maple Ridge, neighbors who had watched the viral clip of the general in the cul-de-sac now watched the national broadcast, their eyes widening as they realized the quiet soldier the general defended with such fire was not simply a capable officer, but one of the most critical cyber defenders in the country. And conversations erupted in living rooms and text threads as people connected the two events with growing disbelief. Back in the hearing chamber, I finished my remarks by speaking not about my achievements, but about the countless unnamed service members who protected the nation in unseen ways. And I said that no one who chooses to serve is ever a mistake, that service is an act of choosing to show up for people who may never understand what you do. And the applause that followed began with a single person before rippling through the room like a rising tide, steady, warm, sincere. In Charlotte, the sound of that applause echoed faintly through the speakers of the old TV, and my mother covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheek, while Maddie stared at the screen in stunned silence, and my father sat motionless, absorbing the unavoidable truth that the nation valued the daughter he had dismissed, the daughter he had humiliated, the daughter whose worth he had reduced to the price of a crumpled bill. By the time the next Christmas season arrived, 2 full years after the hearing, my life had unfolded into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply right, because I had transferred to U.S. Cyber Command at Fort Meade, stepping into a senior role that demanded precision leadership and an unshakable steadiness that I had spent a decade building. Without realizing, I was preparing for exactly this kind of responsibility and the pace of the command center. The constant hum of secured servers, the overlapping conversations about threat vectors and classified alerts created a world where my competence felt natural rather than surprising, a world where no one questioned whether I belonged because the work itself proved it every day. I moved into a small apartment 10 minutes from headquarters, a quiet space with clean lines and warm light, and a small Christmas tree tucked into the corner by the window, its soft glow reflecting off the simple decorations I chose because they reminded me of the holidays I used to imagine rather than the ones I lived through. And as December settled in the cold air outside, the warmth inside my home began to build into something I had never quite experienced before, a feeling of steadiness, of quiet control, of being able to choose who entered my life and who did not. That Christmas Eve, I invited several of the younger soldiers and analysts from my unit, kids really barely out of basic who were stuck far from home on holiday duty rotations, and I cooked for them the way I wished someone had cooked for me when I was 18 and swallowing loneliness like it was oxygen roasting chicken making mac and cheese stirring gravy, while one of them queued up a holiday playlist and the scents of garlic and butter and cinnamon drifted through the apartment as laughter began to fill the space in small, careful bursts that grew louder as the evening settled into something that felt like belonging. We sat around my modest table with paper napkins and mismatched plates because none of us cared about perfection. We cared about warmth and connection. And I looked around at their faces, each one tired, each one grateful, each one holding some story of being overlooked or underestimated, and I realized that for the first time I was not surviving Christmas. I was rewriting what it meant. An hour into dinner, someone knocked on the building door downstairs, and the buzzer sounded softly, a rare interruption in a night I had planned to be simple and gentle. And when I went to check the mailbox alcove, I found a small padded envelope addressed in shaky handwriting. I recognized instantly, even before I picked it up, because the slanted letters, the heavy pen pressure belonged to my father, and the sight of it made my breath pause for a moment, not in fear, but in surprise, a quiet acknowledgement that even after all this time, he still found a way to reach across the distance. I carried the envelope upstairs and opened it at the counter, away from the table, giving myself the mental room to let whatever was inside land without spilling into the atmosphere of the night. And the first thing that fell out was a folded letter, written awkwardly on lined paper, the spelling careful, the tone uneven, as if every sentence had been rewritten in his head before making it onto the page, and beneath it, carefully tucked, as though this time he understood the weight of presentation, were a $10 bill and two $1 bills, crisp and flat, not thrown, not wrinkled, not used as an insult, but placed gently with a sentence written beneath them. "I was wrong, this is yours. I hope someday you will let us earn back more than 12. I stood there for a long moment reading the words, again and again, feeling neither vindication nor anger, just a soft, quiet clarity. Because the letter was not a repair, and it was not a reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement, the first one he had ever offered, and the bills were not payment. They were a symbol, clumsy, tentative, sincere, in the way a man who had never learned how to say sorry might try to learn. I did not tear the letter. I did not burn it. I did not send it back. Instead, I took the 3 bills and placed them in a small black frame I had purchased months earlier, without knowing why, and when I slid the glass into place, the moment felt almost ceremonial, a reminder that the value of my life had never been measured by my father's judgment, nor reduced to the crumpled money he once threw in front of me, because my worth had been proven on battlefields no one saw in server rooms, no one recognized, and in rooms of lawmakers who finally spoke my name with respect. I hung the frame on the wall of my office above my workstation, not as a wound, but as a lesson, that sometimes the things meant to break, you become markers of how far you climbed. And I did not call my father. I did not block him either. I simply held the line of distance, steady understanding that if he truly wanted to rebuild anything, he would have to climb from his own side, not pull on mine. When I returned to the table, one of the youngest soldiers, a quiet kid from Oklahoma, with eyes that carried more worry than someone his age should ever have asked, in a soft, uncertain voice, "Ma, how did you know we belonged here with you tonight?" And the question hit me with a surprising tenderness because it came from the same place I had lived for so many years, the place where someone begins to wonder if they matter at all. I set my glass down and told him the truth, because I know exactly what it feels like to sit alone on Christmas and believe you are a mistake. No one at this table is a mistake. And the room grew warm and still as the others absorbed the words, each of them nodding slightly as if something inside them loosened. Later, as the night deepened and the laughter softened into content, quiet, I stepped toward the window and looked out at the faint reflection of the tree lights catching the edges of the framed $12 in the next room, and I felt the final thread of old hurt dissolve, not into forgiveness, but into peace, because I had built a life where my worth was unquestioned and shared it with people who saw it without needing to be taught. If anyone has ever tried to put a price on your worth, tell me your city in the comments. You and I both know you are worth more than 12.